Hey guys, it's Mary Rose. Welcome to Wednesday, 1 p.m. Pacific time, and I'm live here to talk with you about story structure, writing craft, the mindset of the working writer. I'm so pleased to see you guys here today. I'm going to remind Facebook users, if you want me to know who you are, just do this thing that's in the blue banner at the bottom of my face right now. Go to StreamYard.com/Facebook and get permission to show your name. You'll find a link to it right above or below where this video is playing. Well, here we are of a Wednesday. I hope everybody's doing okay. I'm glad to see a nice group here. I'm going to open up the comments box in case anyone wants to say hi. Let me know who's here and where you're watching from. If you're new to this live stream, I'm Mary Rose Wood. I am an author, best known for my middle grade fiction, which is just a type of fiction that I'm so very fond of. And I think some of the reasons for my fondness will be explored in today's topic. Which is, let me not make you wait another minute. We're going to be talking about this terminology of the difference between a plot-driven book and a character-driven book. It's a very common way of describing not only our work, but our tastes in literature and sometimes our process as writers. So we're going to talk about the terms, but also unravel a bit how we tend to sling these terms around, what they stand in for. So that's the project today. So I hope you all are ready to participate. I'm going to say hi to the folks who are here. Oh, look who's here. Hey, Sarah, what a pleasure to have you here. Nancy, hello. Mia, a pleasure. Constanza, lovely to have you here. Erin, Terry, Jay, Erin, what a nice group we have here. So I have a feeling that you're all familiar with this terminology, and I'm going to be inviting you to comment on what it means to you, and maybe as we talk about it, how you might be willing to broaden or change or invert the way you think about the difference between character driven and plot driven, whether you have any judgments about those terms, whether you value one kind of way of thinking or what you perceive of the meaning of this way of thinking as better or worse than the other. Just there's lots to unravel. So let's get started, shall we? I did want to say I was in the midst of introducing myself. So you might know me as an author from my middle grade fiction, but I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller, which is a program for training and mentoring writers. And so much of what I talk about in these live streams rises quite naturally from the conversations that I have with my students. We're always exploring what makes writing good, what makes it work best for the reader, what makes our process as writers most effective, how we can create stories that are authentic to us, that are somewhat efficiently, designed, so we don't spend years and years just randomly trying to get stuff done without a clear roadmap for how to finish a book, how to revise a book, and really, most of all, how to write stuff that works for our readers. More arrivals. Greetings to Terry and to Hillary. So our topic, let's dive in, shall we? Character-driven versus plot-driven. These terms are very common. I'm sure that everybody has heard them. And you might use them in different contexts. You might say, and I've heard people say this, oh, I prefer character-driven stories. When I'm looking for something to read, I gravitate toward a character-driven story. And someone else might say, I like a really good plot. I like a plot-driven story. That's, I like it where the action is in the front, right? There's a lot happening. It has a feeling of plot driven being more exciting or fast paced, while character driven is maybe more psychological, emotional, focused on relationships. That's just kind of a shorthand, right? If anyone wants to add to that definition, feel free to do it. So we talk about our taste as readers using this terminology of plot driven versus character driven. And many of us who are writers, and I know everyone here watching live is, will also use this terminology to describe our practice as writers. As a writer, I am more character driven. I think about my characters. I like to sort of let the characters lead me. I sit there kind of like a vehicle of just a conduit at the keyboard, and my characters talk to me, and I let them, lead the way. And that's part of my writing process. It's organic. It's improvisational. That's the monologue of the character driven writer, or the writer who says I'm character driven. Where another writer might say, I'm plot driven. I like to know what happens. I like to figure out what happens. Maybe not all of what happens, but bit by bit, I like to figure out what happens. And then later, I deepen the characters. But in my early drafts, my characters tend to be a little flat, a little generic. But I don't worry about that because I'm driven by the plot. And then later on, I'm going to deepen and add dimension to the characters. So those are the two basic definitions. What does this look like in practice? There is a fairly significant school of training for writers, and maybe some of you have been asked to do this, that approaches a character-driven writing by asking the writer to really focus on a biography, to write character descriptions, character biographies, to do a lot of it kind of exploratory preliminary work, developing your characters. And so you might write their whole life story up until the time the book starts. You might do a whole kind of inside the actor's studio exploration of, if I were a tree, what kind of tree would I be? If my character was a tree, what kind of tree would they be? What do they like to wear? What's their favorite song? And what was it like when they went to the prom? Just as if you're writing a biography of a real person, but it's a biography that you're inventing because you're writing it about a fictional character that you're inventing. And so you've got a lot of character sketching going on, and you might be very curious about the psychology of your character, about their emotional lives, and especially about their relationships with others. And you might do that with great enthusiasm and great productivity, and really fill journals and pages of character sketches, character biographies, relationship explorations. You might have stacks of character sketches. You might do one for your main character, and then do one for the parents, and then do one for the siblings, and then do one for the best friends. And you've got to do a whole other one for the love interest. And, it goes on and on. You've got a lot of pages. You've got quite a collection of dossiers by the time you're done doing this exploration. Now, when you've done all that exploration as your process, what do you end up with? I mean, you have a lot of details, right? But you actually have a lot of characters and a big unanswered question, which is, yes, but what do they do? What do these characters do? Well, what's the answer for a really character-driven writer? Well, they'll say, I'll just start writing, and eventually they'll talk to me. They'll tell me what they want to do. And so then we're back in a very organic process. And it almost feels like the writer is a little bit passive in the face of their characters. Now, interestingly, the more work you put into developing your character biographies, the more sense you may develop that my character wouldn't do that, or my character would do that, or I could never make my character do that, or I don't want to be so mean to my characters to have such and such a thing befall them. So it's interesting because you create a lot of, just as in life, we create a lot of baggage, that this set of characters now has all of this stuff attached to it, but you still may not have a very clear idea of what happens, what they're doing in the book. And so you just keep waiting for it to be revealed. Many, many pages can get written in this exploration. Does that mean that knowing your characters inside and out is bad? No, it does not. I'm just describing one approach to process that is falls into the rubric of character driven. Let's talk about what it means to be plot driven. So, if your process, your identity as a writer, and chances are your taste as a reader falls more into the category of plot driven, the ideas that you get for books are not going to be those I had a vision for a character and I started to try to figure out who they were, or I saw someone across a crowded room and that just they came to life in my mind. I imagined a whole backstory for them, and the character invention begins. If you're more of a plot driven person, you probably have something active as your initial inspiration, if you will, for the story that you want to tell. It might be an event of some kind. Uh, and one of the first examples that came to my mind is like, oh, like the voyage of the Titanic. Like, it would be fun to write about that event. What if two people fell in love on the Titanic? Like that's just there's no particular specificity of character. It's more about like, well, it's the Titanic, and it would be very cool to write about the voyage of the Titanic. What could happen on that voyage? And so you just use the event to start to prompt story ideas. Another way to generate story ideas from a plot driven framework would be to think of a problem that needed to be solved, some sort of dilemma that needed to be solved. A crime occurs and someone has to solve it, right? Something needs doing. And, uh, somebody's dog is kidnapped. Someone has to get the dog back. It's a problem. So it starts with the idea of a problem that needs to be solved. It might also be a challenge. You could think of it not necessarily as there's a serial killer on the loose and I'd like to, invent a story about how somebody catches that person. But a challenge like a group of friends decide to climb a mountain together. They're going to climb Mount Everest. I'd like to write a story about that. So that's the challenge. It's the thing that happens that catches your imagination first. And now you've got a thing that happens, but what don't you have? You don't have any people to do it. And this sounds so simplistic, but it's really important to remember that it's impossible to write a story. I guess I shouldn't say impossible. Someone will figure it out. But it's impossible to write a story with no viewpoint, right? There's somebody telling the story. There's someone experiencing, perceiving the story, and it's not a long description of a mountain that is just there. Might be very satisfying in a travel book for a little while, but a novel length work that's trying to have the experience of narrative and give the readers an experience of having been on a narrative requires some characters to have an experience. It's not simply observation of an unchanging landscape. So we don't get too far, right? In order to have a story about the Titanic, you can't just have the Titanic. You have to have people experience what happened. The reader needs an avatar. The reader needs a way to enter into your imaginative world, and we call those characters. They might be human characters, they might be animal characters, they might be plant characters. We hear of stories that have plant characters in them. Why not? We can make all kinds of stuff up. We're imaginative creatures. That's what writers are. But there has to be some way for the reader to get in. So you've got to have some sense of character. In a plot-driven book, you may get your initial idea from the event or the problem to be solved. You may find that to be your way in, and you may say, oh, I'm going to start doing research about the Titanic, or I'm going to do research about how to find a kidnapped dog, or, how to catch a criminal. And you can do a lot of work right? In terms of filling out your initial vision of what your book is going to be. But until you figure out who it happens to, who's the one experiencing the event through whose eyeballs and physical manifestation the reader is going to be able to travel through your story, you're still missing an essential component. So right away, you see that when you lean very heavily on character, you end up having a lot on one side of the scale, but you don't necessarily know what happens yet. And if you end up leaning on plot, you can develop a ton of stuff on the other side of the scale, but you still haven't got the characters that you need in order to have an experience that the reader can access. So, when we talk about plot driven versus character driven, to my mind, we very quickly realize that it's not an either or situation. Now, I want to offer even a third doorway in, just as a little bonus thing to puzzle over to give you even more to think about. There are some writers or perhaps some projects that don't show up knocking on your door saying character driven, here's all this inspiration about characters, plot driven, here's all this inspiration about cool events or challenges, but concept driven. And sometimes as creative people, we may get an inspiration to write about a concept, to explore a concept. What do I mean by a concept? I really would like to write something about the importance of family. I'd really like to write something about the horrors of war. I'd really like to write something about, the unfairness of the economy and how that works and how it affects people. So you see, there's more of an idea. It's kind of an idea-driven approach. And that too can serve as a way into writing a story. But once again, you may get this concept or theme, another useful word to talk about this way of conceiving of a story and getting your process going. You may have this in mind and do a ton of research and do a ton of thinking about it and fill notebooks and notebooks and notebooks with ideas about it. And still, what happens? You look around and you say, well, now I know a lot about whatever my subject is, but I don't have characters and I don't have a plot. So you still have to go searching for them. This is the conundrum, right? And if we stay too rigid in our thinking about stories being either plot driven or character driven, it's harder to know how to shore up the weak half of our inclinations. I would be really curious for those of you who are participating live right now, whether you think of yourself as more of a character driven or a plot driven writer or reader. If you want to post it in the comments, that would be super interesting. I'd like to get a sense of whether it splits evenly or whether most of you think of yourselves as character driven writers or plot driven writers, or maybe you're an idea driven writer and maybe the concepts are what get your creative juices flowing. Whichever it is, just know, and this is really why I chose this topic today, because I think it's important to think about, whichever your inclination is, just know that the piece of it that doesn't come naturally or that doesn't appeal to you more is not it's not something to ignore. It is in fact going to be the part of your work that you may have to engage with most intentionally. Why? Because it's not the part that comes naturally. If you're character driven and you really double down on that and you say, I'm a character driven writer, I like character driven books, and my process is based on character, and when you get into trouble in your creative process, you double down on that, you're ignoring the fact that by being character driven, what you need to pay attention to is plot. What you need to really figure it out is what happens. I'm going to see. Let's see. I'm going to share. We have one answer coming in. I hope there's more soon. Erin shares, starts with ideas, then plot, then character. And then she says, I get to know my characters while writing a more idea and plot driven first draft. See, that's a really interesting, specific, very self aware writer talking. She knows that she gets inspired by an idea. She then invents a plot to explore this idea. And then the last thing that she tucks in is character. And in fact, she gets to know her characters while writing. That's an example of one writer's approach. Let's show somebody else. All right. Erin also says, I start with an idea. She's got a plot-driven orientation as a reader, and then, but also says, I'll more quickly reject content based on the characters. So when she writes, she starts with an idea. When she reads and watches, meaning television or film, there's all kinds of narrative in the world, as we know, she really enjoys the plot. But if she doesn't like the character, she's out of there. Erin, that's really great. I love that self-observation. That's so interesting. We'll return to the idea of how, even though character is like the last on your list, it's the first thing to make you say, I don't like this, right? It's where we can lose you as a reader or a viewer most quickly. Hillary has something to share. Now she's saying I'm character driven. Now she's the first of the group to say character driven. She thinks, but she also gets hooked with a setting. Very interesting, Hillary. A setting in which I'm looking through someone's eyes to see something happen. So maybe plot. So that's really interesting. It's kind of, and I know many writers play with this feeling of almost watching a movie unroll in their heads, the feeling of looking through someone's eyes to see something happening. And so the character feels like it's first for you, and through the looking through the character's eyes, you're looking for something that's happening. So you're looking through the plot through the character's eyes. Really great. Let's see what else we've got to share. Mia says mostly plot driven, but likes to read character driven as well. So there's not a rule either way. A very open minded. And look what Sarah's sharing. She's thinking about it now, and she definitely starts with the plot. We've got lots of great comments here. All right, and great to see Katie here, and she is looking, start with the plot and then goes into fill in character. Really interesting. And very good. And here's the rest of Sarah's comment. She discovers the characters and themes while writing. So she's starting with plot, also on a journey of discovery while writing to discover characters and themes. And then Constanza has an idea. So another idea-driven writer. But then the characters come to life and go their own way. To work out plot then is often a challenge, right? Because the characters start to get a mind of their own. That's a thing that happens. I know that feeling well. Very good. And here we've got another writer. Nancy says she's a concept-driven writer, lots of ideas that excite her and struggling with creating characters, but as a reader, drawn to character. So another writer who's not starting necessarily with character in her own practice, but recognizes that as a reader, it has a huge impact. Kind of like the comment from Erin about saying, yeah, it's plot and concept, but if the characters are not good, I'm out of here. I get up and I do something else. Really interesting. Here's one last comment, and we'll continue kind of integrating this. Jay starts with character in a difficult situation, and she won't start until she has both. And so that difficult situation is like the beginnings of a plot, right? It's a character who's got something to do because they're in a difficult situation. So we can presume that that character wants to change something. So interesting. I love that you all shared that. It's very relatable and very, very interesting to see how many of you are starting with ideas, with concepts. And And you're helping prove a point that I wasn't sure you were going to help me prove, but I'm really glad that you are, which is that we talk about plot driven and we talk about character driven, but in practice, many of us are concept driven. And I never hear that phrase sort of given equal weight when people do this, duality. You're either character driven or plot driven. The truth is that many of us are starting with some kind of concept or theme that we want to explore, we want to write about. And what we have to do then is find the characters and find the plot. So you see the great diversity in how creative people approach their work. How many times do writers come to me with questions about process and they want to know, well, how do you do it? How do you get started? What do you do when you get an idea? What's your first steps? Where do you get your ideas from? And they ask me because I've written a lot of books, and so they think that I must have the way. But you can see from your fellow writers that there are a multitude of ways. There's a multitude of ways. So we have to balance all of these things, right? Character, plot, and concept. And one of the ways that we can do that is to be aware of the red flags that might crop up in our work if we it's like a three-legged stool, and if we have one leg that's weak or too short and it's not evenly supported. So these are some of the red flags that you can look for. If you lead with character and that's something that you really let drive you may end up with stories that have a kind of a weak or amorphous structure. They don't seem to have uh, a shape. They don't escalate. They don't have a sense of forward propulsion. They may be somewhat episodic. They may not be driving toward any kind of peak of difficulty for your main character. There may be no clear sense of what the book is about. And sometimes there may be no clear sense of who the main character is. So if you struggle with, low stakes and scene after scene after scene, but they don't seem to be adding up to much. If I read a scene from the end of your book and I couldn't tell from the emotional tone of it and the stakes of what was going on, whether it was from the beginning of the book or the end of the book, it doesn't feel like a third act scene, and it is in the third act. This is one of the problems of just relying on character, because characters, they're fictional. You made them up. They're not going to structure your book for you. That is, in fact, the writer's job. Now, do character-driven books get written? Sure. There are books that are in which the action, the plot, let's call it, has to do largely with the emotional and psychological shifts in the main character, and maybe mostly to do with relationships, right? And the industry will sometimes call these books quiet, right? Because they are quiet. They don't have an obvious hook. It's not like love story on the Titanic, snakes on a plane. Like, they don't have that very clear one-liner. They have an interior quality, as I said. They're emotional, psychological, and oriented around relationships. And uh, there's there's a fine line between a book that is legitimately quiet and a book that simply hasn't been structured well. It's just a red flag, and I just want you to look for it. You've got the plus of very deeply imagined characters, probably with a lot of rich backstory, a lot of inner life, but your book may not be very solidly structured. It may not have much pace. It may not have even a clear focus on the main character. They may have a passive quality, just that kind of stuff. If you've got stuff like that going on in your work, just know that you may be character driven to a fault. And it might be time to look at plot and concept and try to shore up those elements of your writing. If you're a plot driven writer, you all know that I have a background in the theater, and there's a classic insult in the theater. There are many, of course, because the theater it's such a vivacious profession. People are very good at making witty remarks, often quite cutting. But the old insult in the theater is somebody goes to see a show and they walk out and someone says, how did you like it? And they say, oh, I walked out humming the set. In other words, there was nothing going on stage. It was just a set. And there was stuff maybe going on, but none of it engaged. And it was just the spectacle. It was just the visual that was noticeable, that was memorable. And nobody wants to go see a show and walk out humming the set. That's an insult. Like, that's not what we want to say. We want to take our readers on an emotional journey where they come out of it talking about what happened, talking about their feelings, their emotional engagement with what happened. If all they notice is the set, then you've failed to deliver a full experience. And so a plot-driven book will sometimes can be very skillfully written, very fast-paced, very tight action. A mystery might get solved in a really efficient or exciting or unexpected way. There's a reliance on pace and, in a sense, I want to say spectacle, but what I really mean is a kind of shock value, because you have to use the tools of the plot to engage the reader if you're not focused on character with which the reader can identify. And one of the ways to engage people in a generic way, in a purely reflexive way, is to appeal to their baser instincts. You all know the term rubbernecking, right? Which is this unfortunate phenomenon of humans feeling compelled to look at horrific things, right? So, you're driving on the highway, there's an accident on the other side of the road. Traffic slows down because people slow down to look. And this is just human nature. When something happens that activates our visceral senses of survival and, we need to look. It's kind of similar with erotic stories. People will turn to look, right? If there's a billboard with a very nearly naked person on it, people look. It's not something that we just are blithe about. It appeals to our primal natures, and we look. And so you can see the use of this type of sensational content sometimes becomes a crutch for a plot-driven book that doesn't have a lot of ways to engage the reader other than to keep stimulating them, like on a very primal level. Now, there are some genres of storytelling that do kind of rely on this, and it doesn't mean they're bad genres. Any kind of horror or like murder mystery, romance stories, they appeal to these very primal human instincts. But if that's all they're appealing to, they fall out of genre and into really just tweaking the reader's brain chemistry to get their attention. It doesn't take very much, right? And if you think about advertising and the power of a single still image, a single billboard, a 15-second spot on the television to grab our attention and to make us react or feel something, you see how easy it is to actually seize a human being's attention. If you put certain types of content in front of them, they will react to it. And it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long. A single glance, 10 seconds, and we're hooked. Now, we don't often like the feeling of being, I'll say, manipulated by that. But that is, in fact, the intention of that kind of content is to not ask us if we're interested, but to just show us the kind of stuff that we can't help but look at, because it's manipulating our human natures. So that is a danger that a purely plot-driven approach to writing can can slip into. I don't really often see writers that are so purely plot driven in fiction writing that they end up creating this kind of material. And I think that that's partly because fiction writing invites an exploration of our characters' inner lives. And so it's sort of always there a little bit. But that's not to say that there aren't plenty of books that operate on this level. And you will certainly see in more commercial forms of like television writing and filmmaking, uh, you'll see a lot of this, that it's just almost like generic figurines moving around in a narrative landscape for the sole purpose of providing these highly stimulating manipulative experiences. And guess what? It works. It does work. I don't enjoy that kind of stuff, but there's an audience for it. So what are the red flags with plot driven? If it's hard to care, if you have a story that seems to make logical sense, but it doesn't invite the reader to care at all, if you get feedback on your work that it's flat, that there isn't any kind of a way to engage emotionally, if you get feedback about your main character feeling underdeveloped, we don't know enough, or we don't care about the main character. These are the red flags of being excessively plot driven. I want to talk, since so many of you mentioned it, of whether there were any red flags of being excessively concept driven. And I think that there are. I think that one of the red flags would be if your book starts to be so involved with communicating an idea or arguing a point or laying out information that you think is really important that you want to share with the world, that it just starts to feel didactic. It starts to feel like a thesis as opposed to a story. If you ever get feedback like that, that's something to look at. I would say, in my own experience, that the tricky piece of working with a concept is that a concept is not a narrative, right? You can write a plot-driven narrative, you can write a character-driven narrative, but a concept is just an idea. And so you have to work very hard to figure out how to take the concept that you want to explore and really turn it into a story. How are you going to turn it into a story? Well, obviously, it's going to need characters and it's going to need a plot. So is this just going to be a game of Ring Around the Rosie where we're always trying to figure out, like, am I being too plot driven? Am I being too character driven? Am I being too concept driven? How do I balance all these impulses? How do I make sure that my work is fully realized, that it's not just standing on one leg of the stool? Well, here's where I want to offer a third way, if you will, is to really let go of the idea of plot and character being separate things, and to really think of them as two sides of the same coin. One of the phrases that I often use and teach in the Path of the Storyteller program is the idea that the story or the plot rises from the character. And how that happens is that our character, whom we may not know to the level of a full biography, but what we must know about our main character, our hero, our viewpoint character, is in what way they are ripe for transformation. And if we think about that, and we start to realize that the only way that transformation happens is if the hero is put under some kind of pressure, has to perform on some level, has to leave their comfort zone and move into new realms of conflict, of mission, of engagement. Maybe geographically they move into a new land, maybe emotionally or psychologically they move into a new way of being. But the point is they have to get moving into places and experiences that are going to challenge them in order to achieve the transformation that they're right for. And how does the plot rise from this? Well, it's the nature of the transformation of this hero that's going to design, in a sense, what needs to have happen. And it's really quite specific. If you have a character, you may not know much about that character, but you may decide that the way in which they are ripe for transformation is that they live in a context, in a society, perhaps in a family, where they have been squelched, where they don't have opportunities to achieve their potential, where the kinds of things that they feel within themselves are authentic, are not validated, are mocked or repressed in some way. And this is a character who wants to move out into the world so they can be fully themselves, right? And achieve self-actualization. That it's a kind of story about a character who's been put in a box and really wants to be free to be themselves. That's a pretty generic thing to say. But now you have a very particular kind of transformation in mind. And in order for that character to even begin that journey and achieve it, things are going to happen. It's not a thing that is going to be achieved by sitting in a chair, no matter how comfortable, and just thinking our way out of it. You want a story to be out there where the reader can see it, where we get to watch this character do stuff, go places, try things, and hit pushback, hit the obstacles, and have to get over them one by one so she can earn this transformation that we're really rooting for. We're rooting for her to be the person that she longs to be, in spite of all the obstacles in her path and the obstacles that she may have internalized in her way of thinking about life and herself. She's got to do stuff. And the specifics of what she will do will rise from the character, the need for transformation. That's what it means when I say the plot rises from character. A character who is left inactive is left untransformed. They're inert. They're in a stasis, right? We have to put a character in action in order for them to change. So my personal philosophy about this, my personal practice and what I teach, is that there really is no difference between character and story or plot. The plot or the story that you design for your character is, in fact, the exploration of the character. Now, if you fall into the trap or you've been persuaded that your character is actually this biography that you may have written, that your character is this list of attributes that you may have created for them, you're going to have a hard time with this because you didn't think of all those attributes as part of the plot. You just thought of them as descriptive qualities of this character. And so now it turns out that the only question that matters is, in what way do they need to change? And so your description of all of their qualities is a little bit disposable, because how much of it is going to change? It's, in a sense, it's a description of where we were. It's a historical document. It doesn't actually serve you very well as you move forward into the storytelling. It just describes what was. It's much more fruitful to focus on the way the character needs to change. Now, so many of you shared that you're concept or plot driven. And what I would suggest for you, since you're concept and plot driven, is to look at this again from the framework of character, by understanding that whatever notion you have, whatever concept you have, is going to really need a character to live through it. Above my shoulder here is my most recent book, which is called Alice's Farm: A Rabbit's Tale. And honestly, one of the things that I was very focused on when I was conceiving of that book was that I really wanted to write a book about farming. I wanted to write a book set on a farm and that explored what it meant to be part of the food chain in the 21st century. I'm a a long time and very sincere admirer of Charlotte's Web, which is just about as perfect a book as a book can be. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to sort of revisit this feeling of life on a farm, mortality, friendship, some of the themes of Charlotte's Web, but in a 21st century farm. And that's all pretty compelling. I mean, that was all really interesting. And I got a stack of books by environmentalists and thinkers about the food supply and activists and thinkers like Wendell Berry. I mean, there's a lot of incredible writing about nature and about the relationship between humans and the land we live on and the food we eat, and how this, how we fit into nature, how we abuse nature, what the consequences of us not being mindful of our interactions might be. I mean, I could have done a PhD and written a dissertation about modern farming, but instead I had to think of a story and a character. And so I came up with a plot that is about saving a small family farm. And I came up with a character of a local eastern cottontail rabbit who lives near the land that this farm is on. And I put her in the hero's role of having to do the things that were necessary to save this farm. And then I had to invent a threat to the farm, and I came up with that. And I had to fill in the world of characters. And I'm sharing this with you because so many of you talk about being concept driven. The concept is not enough. It can be a terrific way to start, but you have to be able to then say, okay, that's just one piece of it. I absolutely must have character, and I absolutely must have story. And the question of which is taking the lead is, in a sense, the wrong question. And I think this will be let me come into the conclusion of what I want to talk about. So I warn you that, and just in case anyone has any questions, this would be a really good time to post them in the comments so they show up and I have time to answer them before we wrap up. So in conclusion of my remarks, I just want to say that this duality, this like, is it pants? Is it character driven versus plot driven, is a lot like when writers say, well, which is the best way? Is it pantsing or is it plotting, right? You can see that the character driven people might tend to be more pantsers because they're working intuitively from the impulses of an imaginary creature that they themselves have invented. And the plotters are, in a sense, obviously more plot driven. But it's not an either or. It's really not a duality at all. It's more of a question of how and when in our process we take care of all of these requirements. How and when do we start with character and then let the plot rise from the character's need for transformation? Do we get an idea for a story and then say, okay, what character is going to be the central figure who is transformed by this cool idea that I have for a story? And then go in and do the work of that character and get them to be fully realized on the page, so that it ultimately will still be about their transformation and not necessarily just the cool plot idea that you had. And likewise, if you're a concept driven writer, or if this happens to be a concept driven book, because let's face it, we are going to write a lot of books over the course of our creative lives, right? And some of them we may get an impulse that's character based. Some of them we may have a cool idea for a plot. And some of them we may just have a concept that gets hold of us and we want to explore in terms of fiction. So it doesn't matter which way we go. We may have all of those experiences at various times in our creative lives, but it's how and when. No matter which way we start, we have to sort of just fill in that missing gap. And I would say that we've just got some new arrivals, just waving to Cynthia and to Jean Ann, who's having eureka moments. I'm glad to hear it, Jean Ann. So don't label yourself or your work with any kind of judgment or rigidity. think of these things as really all being of equal value. Oh, here's the thing I wanted to say. If you've got character and you've got plot and you think that your book is not concept driven, I just want to ask you to consider that the journey of transformation that your main character is on is going to inevitably express some kind of worldview. It's going to express a set of values. It almost can't help but do that. And here's why. When you craft an ending for the story, either your hero's going to prevail and save the day, the good guys are going to win, or your hero's going to go down in tragedy and be defeated, and the bad guys are going to win, or the whole situation is going to shift into a inconclusive amoral universe, and it turns out you've written a noir universe in which there is no such thing as right or wrong. It's just everybody out for themselves, right? You'll see that when you get to the ending of your book, the way in which it satisfies you, your impulse of showing how justice is done, how problems are resolved, how conflict uh, becomes untangled, is going to express something about your values. It's going to express something about the vision of life that you want to share with your readers. And chances are there is some kind of theme or concept lurking underneath all of that. And so you may be the kind of writer that doesn't quite know the theme or underlying concept of your book until you've written quite a bit. But it doesn't mean it's not there. If you didn't come into it consciously, you may find that it's there lurking all along. So fantastic. I'm going to go look over to the comments right now, see who's got anything they want to say or questions to ask. Oh, I see we've got a couple of things happening here. That's wonderful. Let me bring Jay's comment up first. So Jay's reading a plot-driven book right now, and she's liking the stories, but the characters are flip-flopping to fit the plot, and that's destroying her engagement. Jay, I'm glad that you shared this because we've had a couple of comments from you guys already that regardless of what you may think intellectually about, oh, I'm plot driven, I'm concept driven, the truth is that the reader comes for the characters. Like the reader wants an iconic, memorable character that they can relate to, not so much in terms of being likable or saying that that a relatable character has to be a good character, but some way that they can experience the events of the story. They've got to be able to inhabit somebody's experience, somebody's skin, if you will, this sort of fictional skin that they can put on so they can enter the world of the book. And if you ever hear people talk about books that they don't like, versus books they do like, you'll see that this is the language they use. I couldn't get into it. I just couldn't get into it. That's just a classic thing that a reader who's not having a good time will say. I couldn't get into it. It didn't engage me. It just didn't grab me. It didn't hold my attention. And that's the opposite of what we say about the books we love, right? We fall into them as if they are happening to us. We feel it's like an immersive experience. When we really love a book, it's like we have entered a world. And so one of the things that I want you to remember is that character, and which is why I skew toward teaching this discipline of story rising from character. It is what the reader ultimately is there for. It's really what they come for. So let's look at a couple of questions. I have a question from Mie about the inspiration for character plot and idea for the incorrigible children. I'll answer briefly, Mie, because I did talk about Alice's Farm being kind of concept driven and also inspired by a book that I admired, which is certainly a great way to get inspiration. We get our mentors on a shelf, right? We can turn to our bookshelves and there are writing mentors everywhere we look. But it was a mix, I would say, of a concept and character, because I was playing what if with myself. And I thought, what if, I'm a great fan of the novel Jane Eyre, as so many sensible people are. And I thought, what if I could write like a governess story of my own, But I also was really intrigued with the idea of characters who were human characters who had animal qualities. It's what I call the Curious George type character. Curious George is an animal who has human qualities, but I was very interested in playing with that. And I also was just kind of as a private joke, this notion of children being raised by wolves, which is such a commonplace saying, but it was such a great what if, like, what if they actually were? And the comic possibilities, uh, those of you who saw an earlier live stream about comedy heard me talk about contrast as a key to comedy. So the comic possibilities of taking not just three children, but three children who are so wild as to be feral, right? They were actually raised by wolves. They don't even behave like children. They bark and howl and bay at the moon and chase squirrels and all this, the fun stuff that I play with in the books. What if you took a Victorian governess and put her in charge of them? So what it did was it maximized the contrast because she's prim and she's clever and she's expecting proper little British school children, and boy, does she get something very different, right? So there was a lot of capacity for comedy there. And there's themes, there's all kinds of stuff to say. It's a 6-book series, so I'm not going to belabor it, but I appreciate you asking. And I hope you can see now that there was a mix of concept and character and plot in the inspiration for those. I am going to bring in another question from Katie. So, as someone that isn't character driven, do you ever feel that characters are two-dimensional in writing? Thoughts on how to ensure characters are multi-dimensional, right? So, if you think you're not someone that's character driven, let me rephrase this, right? If you think of yourself as someone that isn't character driven, how do you make sure that your characters are multi-dimensional? Such an interesting question. I'm going to briefly pivot to this idea of being multidimensional, right? We don't actually have to create our characters outside the frame. We just have to make it seem like they exist outside the frame. It's somewhat of an optical illusion, right? If you look at the portrait of the Mona Lisa, and you turn the canvas over, you don't see the back of the Mona Lisa. She's just on the front. You just get to see the front of her. It wasn't like Da Vinci had to paint the back and the sides and all of the parts that we don't see. He focused on what was going to be in the frame. And we, in fact, do the same thing in our fiction. We just depict what's in the frame. But the truth is, in our developmental work, in our exploratory writing, we may invent a lot of detail about our main characters that never end up in the frame, but we shouldn't hold too tightly to that stuff, because the point of the main character in our fiction is to undergo change, is to be the embodiment of transformation. And the more specific we can be about this transformation, the more alive they will feel to the reader. One of the tricks of making characters feel multidimensional, when in fact they're just words on the page, is to use good writing craft, honestly, because we talk about in studying writing craft, we talk about the necessity of sensory detail, right? And so sensory detail is a way of making the lived experience of a fictional character feel realistic to the reader, so that if we've got a character on the page that we take the time to imagine their physical experience, then they start to feel like they have a physical body, and our reader, who knows very well what having a physical body feels like, is very much engaged. That is a technique of writing craft that actually really helps. If we give our main character a very clear task to accomplish, and then we deliver on the promise to the reader of showing that main character doing the task, encountering obstacles, and having to behave in a realistic way, in a plausible way in the face of obstacles, we're going to be demonstrating a tremendous amount of the humanity of that character. We're going to see what happens when they want something very badly and the types of obstacles that are going to prevent them from getting it. What do they do about it? And just as in life, we don't uh, get our sense of other people necessarily from what is said about them. We get our sense of other people from what they do, from what it feels like to be with them, right? And it's the same with fictional characters. Sometimes writers think, oh, I need my characters to be more dimensional. Let me describe more. Let me describe more. But that's not the key. The key is to put that character in motion, in action, in pursuit of what they want. Then your reader is engaged, literally walking side by side with your character through the tale. And we get to know your character by what they do, by their actions, by the way they are affected by what happens. And so you see that the key to that dimensional character development is actually plot. It's actually the story. Why? Because the story is rising from character. It's the way the character is manifested in the tale. So it's a really great question. I appreciate you asking that. Let's see. I'm going to take one more question because it's after 2, and I know that we've all got stuff to go, but I really appreciate this question. I'm not sure who's asking it, but welcome. I'm glad you're here. So this writer writes picture books, and picture books are notoriously brief. They really are, aren't they? 500 words. What pointers might I have for character-driven works with such few words? I think this is such a great question. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be a picture book expert because I have not had the experience of writing picture books, but I know a lot of people who do, and a lot of people who teach writing picture books. And I would say that it sort of doesn't matter how many words you have. You know, when you buy in to the notion that character is revealed by what the choices that characters make, by what they do, by how they react to what happens, you quickly realize that you could depict a character a fully dimensional character with no words at all if you simply show them in action. You could do a picture book that had no words in it and still have incredibly well developed characters because you put them in circumstances where they had to act in ways that revealed character. I can think of 2 examples right off the top of my head. John Klassen's wonderful I Want My Hat Back. I'm sure it does not even have 500 words. It's got much less than that. The story is told through the pictures, which is, part of the art of crafting picture books, is to sort of figure out how much storytelling the pictures can do. But the characters in that book have such personalities because we have a main character who wants his hat back. He wants his hat and he really wants it back, and he's willing to do a lot of things in order to get it. And so the notion of the character being fully developed is just without question. The other thing that I recommend is a graphic novel, and I just am blanking right now on the artist's name, so please forgive me. I can post it in the comments below after we wind up in a minute. But a wonderful graphic novel called Robot Dreams. And it's not a picture book, it's a graphic novel, and it tells, quite a complex story, and it has no words in it. It is a wordless graphic novel. And the characters are so richly drawn and the plot is so well told because of what happens. It can be depicted. I strongly recommend that all writers let go of their attachment to words being their main job and the solution to all their problems, and to focus a little bit more on the storytelling. Storytelling is not plot. Storytelling is character plus plot plus concept. All of my students know that we talk about all of these things when we talk about story structure. We don't just talk about beats according to a template. We talk constantly about what's driving the main character and what deep themes are revealed by the end of the story. So that's really my message today. Thank you for these great questions that helped me clarify and go into more detail about what I wanted to share with you. I hope that was of benefit. I love having these talks with you on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Pacific. If there's anything that you would like me to talk about in the future, just leave a comment below. I love your suggestions, and I'm always happy to know what you're thinking about. If you're new to the live stream and you're watching on YouTube, I would love it if you subscribe to the channel. It's a big help to me and to this content, and helps it get put in front of more writers and hopefully be of greater benefit. I'm so grateful. Katie's telling me a big thank you. You're a gift too, Katie. I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you who are here participating live. This was a really great give and take. And I learned more about you today. And I hope you've got some good stuff to think about. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.